The wind whispered through the deserted train station, stirring up dry leaves that danced in slow spirals before settling on the cracked pavement. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, the scent of distant rain, mingling with the lingering rust of metal long abandoned. The platform, once bustling with travelers, now stood in eerie silence, the wooden benches weathered and worn by years of neglect. The faded station sign creaked softly, swaying with each passing gust, as if it too had grown tired of waiting. And yet, he remained. A lone figure sat at the edge of the platform, still as a shadow cast by the fading daylight. A large black dog, his coat thick and unkempt, blended seamlessly with the encroaching darkness. His ears twitched at the sound of rustling leaves, his nose lifted slightly to catch the evening breeze, but his body remained motionless, eyes locked onto the empty train tracks stretching into infinity. Shadow had been sitting there for 5 years. He did not wander the streets in search of food, nor did he seek the warmth of shelter when the winters grew merciless. The town had long since accepted his presence as a quiet, solemn fixture of the station. He never barked, never chased after passers-by, never acknowledged the voices calling out to him. He only waited. It had become a story of its own, one the town whispered about in hushed voices. Who is he waiting for? No one has come for him in 5 years. Maybe he doesn't know they're never coming back. The small town of Millersville had seen its fair share of lost souls, people who stayed even after they had every reason to leave. But Shadow was different. He wasn't a stray. He wasn't searching for scraps or kindness. He was waiting. For something. For someone. The town's silent guardian. Among those who had taken notice of Shadow was Clara Evans, the owner of the town's only cafe. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes softened by years of kindness, Clara had been one of the first to leave food for the dog. She would arrive early in the morning just before dawn, when the station was at its quietest. A small plate of scrambled eggs and ham, sometimes a piece of toast, placed carefully near the old wooden bench. Then she would leave without looking back. She had learned, like the others, that Shadow would only eat once he was alone. She often watched him from the window of her cafe, sipping her coffee as the morning commuters passed by. Some ignored him completely, while others paused, casting him a curious glance before moving on. No one ever tried to chase him away. "I don't know who he's waiting for," Clara would tell anyone who asked, "but I can tell you one thing, he's not leaving until they come back." Others had tried to help. Sam Walker, a long-haul trucker, had attempted more than once to take Shadow with him. "I figured a dog like that didn't belong in a place like this," Sam had told Clara one morning over his usual black coffee. "Got a big enough rig, could have given him a home on the road. But you know what happened?" Clara already knew. Shadow refused. The first time Sam had tried, he had whistled, patted his knees, offered the dog a treat. Shadow only stood up, took a few cautious steps back, then sat down again, eyes never leaving the tracks. The second time, Sam brought a leash, a sturdy one, meant for strong dogs. He knelt down, spoke gently, even tossed a fresh steak in Shadow's direction. The dog didn't touch it. "The moment I got too close," Sam recounted, shaking his head, "he ran off. Not far, just enough to make sure I couldn't get to him. Then he sat right back down." "Like he was afraid to leave?" Clara had asked. Sam had taken a sip of his coffee before replying. "No." He had exhaled, rubbing his forehead, like he was afraid he'd miss something if he did. The town had come to respect Shadow's silent vigil. No one disturbed him anymore. No one tried to force him to leave, because deep down, they all knew the truth. Shadow wasn't just waiting. He was keeping a promise. A mystery that refused to fade. As the seasons passed, the legend of the waiting dog grew. Travelers passing through Millersville would snap photos, post them online, share his story. Some would stop and watch him for a few minutes as if expecting a miracle to unfold before their eyes. But Shadow never moved. He endured the scorching summers, his black coat soaking up the relentless heat, panting but never seeking shade for long. He weathered the harsh winters, curling up against the cold, his fur matted with snow, his breath visible in the icy air. Even during the worst storms, when rain pounded against the pavement and thunder rattled the sky, Shadow remained. His body trembled, but he never ran for cover. And every time the train whistle echoed in the distance, his ears perked. His head lifted, tail stiff. He always waited until the sound faded before lowering his head again. Every single time. The town could only wonder. Had he been left behind? Had someone promised to return but never did? Was it possible he was waiting for a face that no longer existed in this world? Or was there a chance that, somewhere out there, someone was looking for him too? A story, waiting to be told. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a car rolled into town, slowing near the station. Inside, a man watched the motionless figure by the tracks. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his mind racing. He had heard the stories, he had seen the photos, but seeing it with his own eyes, that was different. His journalist instincts buzzed with anticipation. "Who are you waiting for, Shadow?" Jake Ryan, investigative journalist, had just found his next story, and he wasn't leaving until he uncovered the truth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet town of Millersville as Jake Ryan pulled his car into a parking spot near the town's only cafe. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods drifted through the air, but Jake wasn't here for a break. His sharp eyes locked onto the figure sitting near the abandoned train station, unmoving, silent, and strangely resolute. The black dog was exactly as described. Jake had heard the whispers, stories of a dog that had waited at the same spot for years, unmoved by time, weather, or the world changing around him. Some called it loyalty, others a mystery. But as a journalist, Jake saw something else, a story begging to be uncovered. He had spent the last decade chasing down human interest stories, the kind that went viral, the kind that left people with a lump in their throats. But this was different. There was something unsettling about seeing it firsthand. The way Shadow sat, ears slightly perked whenever the distant whistle of a train echoed through the valley. The way his dark eyes never strayed from the rusted tracks, filled with an unwavering patience. It wasn't just sad, it was haunting. Jake grabbed his notebook and stepped out of his car. The cool autumn breeze carried the sound of laughter from a few kids riding their bikes down the street, but the closer he got to the station, the quieter the world seemed to become. He crossed the street and approached Clara's cafe, where the door chimed as he stepped inside. Clara, wiping down the counter, looked up and immediately knew why he was there. "You're here for the dog," she said simply, setting aside her rag. Jake gave her a small, knowing smile as he slid onto a stool. "You don't seem surprised." She chuckled, pouring him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. "You're not the first to come through town asking about him, but you might be the first with a notepad." Jake pulled his pen from his jacket pocket. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Clara leaned on the counter, glancing out the window at Shadow, who was still in the exact same position. "Ask away." Jake flipped open his notebook. "How long has he been here?" Clara didn't even have to think. 5 years. Jake let out a low whistle. "That long?" She nodded. "I remember the first time I saw him. Just showed up one morning and never left. I started leaving food out, but he wouldn't touch it until I walked away. At first, we all thought he was just another stray, but then we noticed—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He wasn't looking for food. He wasn't looking for shelter. He was looking for something else." Jake tapped his pen against his notebook. Someone else. Clara's eyes met his, confirming what he already suspected. "I take it people have tried to take him in?" Jake asked. "Plenty," she said with a sad smile. "Truckers passing through, families who thought they could give him a warm home. Even the town vet tried once." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And?" She sighed. "He never fought them. He never barked or growled. But the second they tried to take him, he'd slip away. He wouldn't run far, just far enough to sit back down and keep watching the tracks." Jake scribbled notes quickly, his mind racing. "So no one knows where he came from?" "No one," Clara said, shaking her head. "But I'll tell you this, he's waiting for someone, and I don't think he's leaving until they come back." Jake took a sip of his coffee, staring out the window at Shadow. His heart clenched slightly at the sheer devotion the dog exhibited, unwavering even after 5 years. He had covered missing persons cases before. He had written about reunions between lost pets and their owners. But this felt different. There was a weight to it, an unspoken sorrow that wrapped itself around the town like a fog. As he left the cafe, he made his way toward the station, stepping cautiously as he approached Shadow. The dog flicked his ears in acknowledgement but did not turn his head. Jake crouched a few feet away, studying the way Shadow's muscles remained taut, ready to move if needed, yet utterly still. Shadow blinked slowly, unbothered by his presence. Jake pulled out his phone, snapping a quick photo. He had an instinct for these things. This story had potential. But it needed more. He needed to understand. That night, back in his motel room, Jake pored over his notes. His fingers moved instinctively across his laptop's keyboard as he began searching online databases, news archives, missing pet reports, anything that could connect to Shadow's past. Then he found it. A photo, buried deep within an old news article from 5 years ago. It was a grainy image taken at the very train station where Shadow now waited. The station had been livelier then, the paint fresher, the platform less worn. But it wasn't the background that made Jake's breath hitch. It was the people in the photo. A man stood on the platform, holding the hand of a young girl. Both were smiling, and in front of them a dog sat proudly, ears perked, tongue lolling in contentment. The same dog that was now a shadow of himself. Jake stared at the image, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just a lost dog. This was a missing piece of someone's life. He leaned back, exhaling. What had happened? Where had the man and the girl gone? And why, after all these years, had Shadow never stopped waiting? Jake's fingers hovered over his keyboard. His next move was clear. He was going to find out. The late afternoon sun painted the quiet street in shades of amber as Nathan Collins pulled into the driveway. The old picket fence rattled slightly in the breeze, and as soon as he turned off the ignition, a deep bark rang through the air. A black German shepherd bounded toward the car, tail wagging, ears perked in excitement. From the passenger seat, Lily Collins, just 9 years old, let out a delighted laugh and threw the door open before Nathan could even unbuckle his seatbelt. "Shadow!" she squealed, dropping her backpack as she knelt to hug the dog. Shadow responded immediately, licking her cheek, his tail sweeping back and forth with boundless energy. Nathan stepped out of the car, watching the scene unfold with a small smile. He had seen this reunion play out every day since the moment they had brought Shadow home. To the outside world, Shadow was just a dog, loyal, obedient, protective. But to Nathan and Lily, he was family. Nathan had adopted Shadow after his service in the military. The dog had once been part of an elite K-9 unit, trained for discipline and courage. But after years of service, Shadow had been retired, left without a purpose, until Nathan took him in. For a man like Nathan, who had spent years in uniform, the transition to civilian life had been jarring. Losing his wife shortly after Lily was born, had left him raising his daughter alone, navigating the delicate balance of being a father while carrying the weight of his past. Shadow had filled a space in their home that neither of them had realized was missing. For Lily, Shadow was more than just a pet. He was her best friend, her protector, her constant companion. He slept beside her bed, followed her to the school bus stop, and waited patiently until she returned. He was the first to greet her in the mornings, and the last to nuzzle her good night. "Daddy, do you think Shadow knows how much I love him?" Lily had asked one evening, her small fingers stroking the dog's thick fur as they sat on the porch. Nathan had chuckled, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "Sweetheart, if love could be measured, Shadow's got a lifetime supply from you." She grinned, resting her head against the dog. "Good, because I love him forever." Shadow let out a content sigh, curling protectively around her. Their family of 3 was complete. But fate had other plans. The morning of their trip was crisp and cool, the kind of autumn day where the air smelled like damp leaves and the sky stretched endlessly in soft hues of gray. Nathan packed their bags into the truck while Lily fussed over Shadow, making sure he had his favorite toy, fresh water, and an extra snack in his bowl. "We won't be gone long, buddy," Nathan reassured the dog as he crouched to scratch behind his ears. "Just a quick trip to see Grandma and Grandpa. We'll be back before you know it." Shadow whined softly, pressing his nose into Nathan's palm. He wasn't used to being left behind. Lily knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. "Be good, okay? We'll bring you a treat when we get back." She kissed the top of his head before standing up. As they arrived at the train station, Shadow sat obediently by Nathan's side, watching the world move around them. The station was small, with only a handful of people waiting for the morning train. The tracks stretched into the distance, cutting through the trees that framed the quiet town. Nathan led Shadow to a shaded spot near the platform. He knelt, resting a firm hand on the dog's back. "You stay here, boy. We'll be back soon." Shadow's ears twitched, his eyes flicking between Nathan and Lily. Nathan smiled. "I promise." Then, the train arrived. The sound of the whistle startled Shadow slightly, but he stayed put, his training keeping him disciplined. He watched as Nathan picked up their bags, took Lily's hand, and walked toward the doors. Just before stepping inside, Lily turned back, blowing a kiss toward Shadow. "See you soon, Shadow." The door slid shut. The train lurched forward, and Shadow waited. The moment everything changed. At first, he sat there just as he had been told. His eyes never left the tracks, his ears twitching with every distant rumble of passing freight trains. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the pavement beneath him. Still, he waited. But something was wrong. The next train arrived, but Nathan and Lily were not on it. Shadow's tail, which had wagged slightly in anticipation, lowered. The trains kept coming, but they never returned. And then the whispers began. A commotion at the station, hurried conversations, people murmuring about an accident. A train derailed miles away from town. A tragedy. Reports spoke of passengers being pulled from the wreckage, medical teams dispatched in a flurry of flashing lights and sirens. Shadow couldn't understand the words, but he could feel it. His family wasn't coming back, yet he did not move. As night fell and the station emptied, Shadow remained in his spot. His ears twitched at every passing train, his body stiff with anticipation. He refused to leave. Someone tried to coax him away, offering food and gentle words. He backed up a few steps, then sat back down, his eyes locked onto the tracks. The next morning, when the sun rose, Shadow was still there. Days turned into weeks. People in the town took notice. Food was left out, but he never ate until the giver was gone. Shelter was offered, but he never sought warmth away from the tracks. Seasons changed, but Shadow never wavered. Through the scorching heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter, he remained. 5 years passed, and still he waited. The people of Millersville grew used to the sight of the dog at the station. Some called it heartbreaking, others beautiful. Travelers stopped to take pictures, their voices filled with quiet awe. But no one knew the truth. No one knew who he was waiting for, or why, despite everything, Shadow still believed they would return. Jake sat in his dimly lit motel room, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence as he stared at his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the weight of the story pressing against his chest. He had written countless articles before, but none had left a mark on him quite like this one. He glanced at the photo again, the grainy image from 5 years ago, capturing a man, a little girl, and a black German shepherd standing at the very train station where Shadow now waited. The same eyes, the same fur, the same unwavering presence. There was no doubt. Shadow had once been loved. He had belonged to someone. Jake exhaled sharply, determination settling in his bones. He couldn't let this story remain a mystery. He pulled up Twitter, his fingers typing quickly. This dog has been waiting at an abandoned train station for 5 years. He never leaves. He never stops watching the tracks. Someone out there must know him. Please, help me find his family. He attached the old photo side by side with a new one. Shadow sitting at the edge of the platform, his eyes locked on the tracks, the years of waiting etched into his body. With one final glance, he hit post. At first, there was nothing, just a few likes, a couple of retweets. Then, the floodgates opened. Within an hour, Jake's phone started buzzing, hundreds, thousands. The posts spread like wildfire. Comments poured in. This is breaking my heart. Please tell me this dog finds his family. Someone must know who he belongs to. Then, the national news outlets picked it up. The headline spread across platforms. The dog who never left. A 5-year wait at an abandoned train station. Jake watched, stunned, as the numbers skyrocketed. Hundreds of thousands of shares, millions of views. Celebrities, animal rescue organizations, and pet lovers across the country were talking about Shadow. People offered to adopt him, to take him in, but Jake knew that wasn't what Shadow wanted. Shadow wasn't waiting for a new home. He was waiting for the one he lost. And then, the moment happened. Across the country, in a quiet Denver suburb, a 14-year-old girl named Lily Collins was scrolling through her phone. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just mindless scrolling, avoiding homework, flicking past photos and videos until one image made her stop cold. She blinked, her breath hitching in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled back. And there, staring back at her, was Shadow. Her vision blurred instantly with tears. "No," she whispered, heart pounding. It wasn't possible. Shadow was gone. That's what she had been told. That's what she had forced herself to believe all these years. But the dog in the photo, the posture, the eyes, the way he sat as if frozen in time, was unmistakable. She read the caption, her vision swimming. This dog has been waiting at an abandoned train station for 5 years. He never leaves. He never stops watching the tracks. Someone out there must know him. A sob broke from her lips. Shadow. You're still waiting for me. Her hands fumbled, barely able to type as she commented beneath the post. That's my dog. His name is Shadow. He's waiting for my dad. But my dad never came back. The comment blew up instantly. People started tagging Jake, urging him to respond. Jake, who had been monitoring his notifications, froze when he saw it. His pulse kicked up. He clicked on the girl's profile, scanning her pictures. Then he saw it. A photo from 5 years ago. A younger version of Lily, smiling brightly as she hugged Shadow in her backyard. Jake's heart pounded. This was it. This was Shadow's family. Lily could barely speak as she stumbled into the kitchen, her phone clutched in a death grip. "Mom!" she gasped, her voice breaking. Her mother, Emily Collins, looked up from the dishes, concerned. "Lily? What's wrong?" Tears streamed down Lily's face as she held out her phone. "It's him! Shadow! He's still waiting!" Emily's breath caught as she took the phone, reading the post, her face paling. "Oh my God," she whispered. She sank into a chair, her fingers covering her mouth. The weight of it all, the memories, the grief, the unbearable thought of that dog waiting all this time, hit her like a tidal wave. Lily was already running toward the door. "We have to go! We have to get him!" she pleaded. Emily hesitated. She was afraid. They had moved on. They had built a new life in Denver. The loss of Nathan had been devastating, and Shadow had been part of that pain, a reminder of what they had lost. But this changed everything. Lily's voice broke. "Mom, Shadow didn't give up on us. We can't give up on him." Emily's hesitation crumbled. She grabbed her car keys. "Let's bring him home." Jake's phone rang barely 10 minutes after Lily's comment. He answered immediately, the urgency in his voice mirroring hers. "Where is he?" Lily asked, breathless. "He's still at the station," Jake said. "He never leaves." "We're coming," she choked out. "Please, don't let him leave." Jake swallowed hard. "I don't think he ever planned to." The call ended, and Jake sat back, exhaling sharply. This was it. Shadow's wait was about to end. But one question remained. After 5 years, would he still recognize her? Word spread quickly through Millersville. By the time Jake made it back to the station, a small crowd had gathered. Clara was there, along with Sam and a handful of locals who had fed Shadow over the years. They all knew what was happening. They all knew that today might be the last day Shadow would wait alone. The sky was darkening, the air thick with an unspoken anticipation. And Shadow? He was still there, still watching, still waiting. Jake crouched near him, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming, buddy," he murmured. "They're finally coming." Shadow didn't move, didn't react. But something in his eyes changed. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves across the pavement. The sound of an approaching car grew louder, and then headlights appeared in the distance. Jake felt his breath catch. The crowd grew silent. The car slowed, pulling into the station lot. The engine cut off, and then the door swung open. A girl stepped out. Her hair was longer now, her face older, but her voice. Shadow? It was the same. And that was when, for the first time in 5 years, Shadow moved. The car door swung open and Lily stepped out, her breath catching as her shoes met the cracked pavement of the station lot. The air was thick with anticipation, the sky painted in deep shades of twilight, as if the world itself held its breath for this moment. She had imagined this reunion 1,000 times in her head, what she would say, how it would feel. But now, standing there, staring at the motionless figure just a few yards away, words failed her. Shadow sat at the edge of the platform, exactly where he had always been. The dim glow of the station's flickering lights cast a golden sheen over his thick black fur, but he didn't move. He simply watched, his ears twitching slightly, his body frozen in place. Lily's heart pounded. "Shadow," she whispered, barely able to get the name past the lump forming in her throat. The dog's ears perked. His head tilted slightly. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides as a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Shadow, it's me," she choked out, stepping forward. "It's me. I'm here." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying her voice toward him. For a long, agonizing moment, Shadow didn't move. His dark eyes studied her, cautious, hesitant. There was recognition, but also uncertainty. as if 5 years of waiting had made the memory fragile, blurred at the edges. He had been disappointed before. He had imagined this moment before. And yet, Lily was standing here, saying his name in the same soft, hopeful voice that had once called him home every day. She took another shaky step forward. "Shadow," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "It's me. It's Lily." A sharp gust of wind rushed through the station, sending dry leaves scattering across the pavement. The world around them seemed to stretch, holding its breath. And then it happened. Shadow's body tensed, his ears standing straight. His nose twitched, inhaling deeply, as if searching for something familiar in the air. Then, in one swift motion, he moved. It wasn't a slow realization. It wasn't cautious. It was instant. Shadow launched himself forward, his paws hitting the ground with force, closing the distance between them in seconds. Lily barely had time to react before he collided into her, knocking her backward onto the pavement. She let out a gasp as the weight of him pressed against her chest. But she didn't care. Because Shadow was here. Because he knew her. Because he had never forgotten. A strangled sob broke from her lips as Shadow buried his face against her neck, pressing into her as if trying to make sure she was real. His body trembled against hers, not from fear, but from sheer, overwhelming relief. And then he whined. A deep, heartbreaking, relieved whimper that made something inside Lily completely shatter. She wrapped her arms around him, gripping his thick fur with trembling fingers, pressing her face into his neck as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry, Shadow. I didn't know you were waiting for me." Shadow whined again, his tail thumping wildly against the pavement. He licked her face, nudging her with his nose, as if scolding her for taking so long. Lily let out a watery laugh, her fingers running through his fur, her chest tightening with so much love, it hurt. "You waited for me," she whispered. "All this time. You never gave up on me." Shadow let out a soft huff and pressed his forehead against hers, his warm breath mingling with hers. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered, Clara, Sam, Jake, and a handful of town residents, watched in stunned silence. Some wiped away tears. Others simply stood there, unable to look away from the moment unfolding before them. Even Jake, who had spent years telling emotional stories, felt his throat tighten. He had hoped for a reunion. He had expected tears. But this was something else entirely. It was as if time itself had stitched the past and present together, erasing the years of waiting in one breathtaking instant. Lily pulled back slightly, cupping Shadow's face in her hands, staring into the deep brown eyes she had missed so much. "Come home with me, boy," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Let's go home." Shadow blinked once, twice. Then, as if there had ever been a doubt, he let out a deep, joyful bark, the first sound he had made in years. The crowd let out a collective exhale, relieved, overjoyed, in awe. Lily wiped her tears, laughing through them as Shadow circled around her, his tail wagging so fiercely it looked like it might lift him off the ground. She turned toward her mother, who had tears streaming down her face as well. Emily nodded. "Let's take him home." Lily grinned, standing up and reaching for Shadow's old collar, which Jake had brought just in case. She knelt, clipping it gently around his neck. "Ready, buddy?" Shadow pressed his head against her chest one last time before stepping beside her, as if he had never left her side. As if he had never spent 5 years alone, waiting, longing, hoping. The journey had been long. The wait had been painful. But tonight, Shadow was going home. The car ride home was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the tires against the road. Lily sat in the back seat, her arms wrapped tightly around Shadow as if she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. Shadow, for the first time in 5 years, was no longer tense. His body, once rigid with anticipation and sorrow, now leaned into her warmth. His head rested on her lap, his deep breath steady, as if he finally allowed himself to relax. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart clenching at the sight. The dog they had lost, the one she had believed was gone forever, was here, right in front of her, still loving, still waiting, still Shadow. When they pulled into their driveway, Shadow lifted his head, his ears flicking at the unfamiliar sounds. It had been so long. The house was different from the one he had once known, but Lily's scent was the same. He could still feel the familiar comfort of her presence, yet something inside him hesitated. Lily opened the door and stepped out, gently tugging Shadow's leash. "Come on, boy," she coaxed softly. "This is home now." Shadow took a hesitant step forward, then another. His paws touched the pavement of the driveway, and he sniffed the air cautiously. He didn't run inside. Instead, he stood at the threshold, eyes flicking back to Lily as if asking for permission. Lily knelt beside him, stroking his head. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." Shadow stepped inside. At first, he was wary. He paced through the house, his tail low, sniffing every corner, every room. He hesitated near the back door, lingering there as if still expecting someone to call him back to the train station. For the first few nights, he slept near the door, his body curled up tightly, his ears always listening, always waiting. Lily noticed. She would wake up in the middle of the night and find him there, his eyes half open, watching. She sat beside him on the floor one night, running her fingers through his fur. "You don't have to wait anymore," she murmured. "I promise I'm not leaving." Shadow's ears flicked, but he didn't move. It took time. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, Shadow began to trust again. He started sleeping near Lily's bed. Then one morning, Lily woke up to find him curled up at her feet, his body finally at ease. Her heart swelled as she reached out, stroking his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Then came the little changes, the things that told her he was healing. One evening, he trotted into the backyard, hesitating only for a moment before stepping onto the grass. His tail gave a small wag. The next day, he chased a butterfly, something he hadn't done since he was a young dog. Then finally, the moment Lily had been waiting for. She stood at the edge of the yard, holding a ball. "Shadow," she called, her voice light with hope. "You want to play?" For a second, he just stared. Then, his tail wagged, not just a small, cautious flick, a real, full wag. Lily's breath hitched. She tossed the ball, and Shadow ran. Tears filled Lily's eyes as she watched him chase after it, bounding across the yard with an energy she hadn't seen in so long. He grabbed the ball in his mouth, then turned back to her, ears perked, tail wagging wildly. She laughed, clapping her hands. "That's my boy." Shadow dropped the ball and ran straight for her, pressing his head against her chest. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. He was home. While Shadow was learning to trust again, Jake Ryan was finishing the most important article of his career. He had written hundreds of stories before, some about tragedy, some about hope. But this one? This was different. This wasn't just a story about a lost dog. It was about loyalty, patience, and a love so strong that not even time could break it. Jake's final draft read, "For 5 years, a lone dog waited at an abandoned train station, refusing to leave, refusing to give up hope. He wasn't lost. He wasn't abandoned. He was waiting for the family he loved, the one he believed would come back for him. And against all odds, they did." Jake included the pictures, the before and after. The first, of Shadow sitting alone on the platform, eyes locked on the horizon. The second, of him running across a backyard, tail wagging with Lily laughing beside him. And finally, he ended with a single line that resonated across the world. Not every stray is abandoned. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone who still loves them. The article went viral overnight. It was shared across every platform: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. People commented, crying over Shadow's story, over his loyalty, over the bond that had survived the test of time. Animal shelters saw a spike in adoptions as people were reminded of the unbreakable love dogs carry for their humans. Jake received messages from thousands of readers, all saying the same thing: Shadow's story changed the way I see animals forever. The message that would last forever. In the weeks that followed, Shadow settled into his new life. He was no longer the silent, waiting figure at the train station. Now he played in the yard. He slept soundly on Lily's bed. He wagged his tail freely, no longer waiting, just living. And one evening, as Lily sat on the porch with Shadow lying beside her, she whispered, "You waited for me, didn't you?" Shadow lifted his head and rested it on her lap. His tail thumped softly against the wood. Lily smiled, wiping away a tear. "Well, I promise. I'll wait for you too, no matter what." Shadow let out a soft sigh, his eyes closing, completely at peace. Lily pressed a kiss to his head. Because no matter how much time had passed, love had never left. Because love never truly disappears. Because some promises are never broken. And because loyalty, like Shadow's, lasts forever. The bond between humans and dogs is one of the purest forms of loyalty and love, and few dog stories capture that truth as powerfully as Shadow's. His journey is more than just an emotional reunion. It is a reflection of the unwavering faith that dogs carry in their hearts, a reminder that love, even when tested by time and distance, never truly fades. At its core, this is a heartwarming story about devotion, patience, and the silent resilience of animals who love beyond conditions. Dogs don't count the days they are apart from the ones they love. They simply wait, believing that one day the door will open, the familiar voice will call, and everything will be right again. Their love is constant, unaffected by the passage of time, and Shadow's story serves as a testament to that kind of unwavering faith. Beyond its emotional weight, this story carries an important message about trust and healing. For dogs who have endured loss or separation, regaining trust isn't immediate. Like people, they carry wounds, seen and unseen, that take time to heal. But with patience, kindness, and the reassurance of a familiar presence, even the most broken spirits can learn to believe again. Shadow's journey from waiting in solitude to running freely once more is symbolic of the healing power of love, something that extends beyond animals and applies to all of us. This is also a story about hope. Too often, dogs who are seen alone, waiting in the same place for days, weeks, or even years, are assumed to be strays, abandoned, or forgotten. But as Shadow's story shows, some are simply waiting for someone who still loves them. It's a reminder to look twice, to see beyond appearances, and to recognize the deep emotional world that dogs inhabit. They are not just pets, they are family, and their love is a gift we should never take for granted. The impact of a story like this reaches far beyond one dog and one family. It encourages compassion. It inspires people to cherish their own pets a little more, to adopt rather than shop, and to believe in the power of second chances. In the end, this heartwarming story is about more than just a lost dog finding his way home. It is about the unbreakable connection between hearts that refuse to forget one another, no matter how much time has passed. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.